Hello everyone. In this lesson, let's create the context for our web application. In the context, I want to include user information, whether they are authenticated or not. Currently, you may notice that we have 3 places where we call getMe. This is on the Idea View page to determine if they are the author and show them the appropriate button. On the Edit Idea page to check if they can edit it at all, and in the layout to display the appropriate buttons to them. In the future, you will need this user everywhere, almost everywhere, and it's inconvenient to request it separately each time, waiting for it to load. In general, this all adds a lot of clutter to our code. And I would like to move this to a separate place so that in different parts of the app, we can simply access our user, knowing it is already loaded. This is what application contexts are created for. So, let's create a file in the lib folder named createContext, and its core will be like this. Let's break it down. Here, we will use the React hook useContext and the function createContext. But first, let's define the type of our app context. In essence, the app context contains an object, which holds me, returning what our TRPC router's getMe procedure provides in the me object. I remind you, we defined this type of TRPC router on the backend thanks to the TRPC helpers. We will pass the type of our TRPC router into it. All right, we have our me here. If you look at the getMe procedure itself, you'll see it returns the me object, hence the path name getMe, where we take me and put it here. Then we create the so-called React context using the createContext function, defining its type. And initially, by default, it will equal 0. That's it. This is the app context. Please note, this is not a type. It is a component like this. All right? Then we create the app context provider, and we'll wrap it, yes. Let's even do it straight away. We'll wrap our application. Go to app.tsx and wrap it. Since we'll use TRPC in this app context to request the user, we need to wrap our application below where we have TRPC. Well, you can do it here. TRPC context provider. All right, we declared it here. Declared and imported. All right, let's go back. So, what's in this app context provider? So when our render reaches here, this component will render. In it, we usually call useQuery for getMe and get all the information about this procedure. And then we set the value in app.context provider. And there will be me. If it hasn't loaded yet, it'll be null. If me is already null, it'll still be null. That is, here we define the value of our context. More precisely, it is redefined. Initially, it was defined here. It is redefined here depending on what this query returned. And again, if we have loading or fetching, we will show loading. So, our render won't proceed any further. That is, we will just have loading. If there's an error, we will show the error. But here we assume that there will never be an error because it's a simple function, nevertheless. And if there is neither an error nor loading, then we return children. And the children include all of this, so our application will load further. Okay, here we have such an app.context.provider. And we wrapped everything we have in our application in this app.context.provider. Okay? And we need to get these values somewhere later from this very context. So we create a function useAppContext. And in it, we have this thing useContext, to which we need to pass app.context. And then it will return the type of our app.context. That is, directly this our me, authorized or not. But in the future, you might want to add something else to this context. For example, you might have some application settings determined on the server. I don't know. For instance, the current dollar rate or something similar. And you request this from the server, and you need it in many places. Nothing stops you from adding some settings here. Add settings here. I don't know. Suppose you have a router one day, some kind of route to get settings. Settings. Something like this will happen. And please, you will be able to receive it in the same way. But to make it convenient for you to use, we create additional wrappers over useContext, like this. Just use me. It retrieves me and just returns me. Not as an object, but as a direct value. Good. We created this hook. Use me. And we get me from it. Let's go apply this hook and understand more deeply how it all works. So, if before we had to load the user. Now we know that if the layout is loaded, it means all the loads in app.context provider have already been completed. Therefore, we don't need to wait for any loads in the layout here, because all the loads have already passed, and we can simply do the following. Const me equals use me. That's it. And what type do we have for me? We see that it's either a user or null. Great. So we don't need all these checks. We just need, if there is a user, then show this. And if there's no user, we'll show this. It's become much easier to read and more convenient. All right, moving on. Let's apply it to the Edit Idea page. Here we have a bunch of various conditions, and now some of them will be significantly reduced. Okay, so we don't need getMeResult anymore. We can simply use. Right. Use me. Got use me. Accordingly, these checks are no longer needed. This check is no longer needed. This one is needed. Me is already defined, and that's all. So again, we simplified everything. I think I haven't talked about this yet, but I will. So if you're using some hooks. Hooks are anything that starts with the word use. They should be before you make any return. In other words, hooks can't be optional. This is a React rule. So with every render, you should call the same hooks in the same order. And because of this, we actually had to move the component with editing here. Because if the checks hadn't passed, well, if they had passed, we would have wanted to call the useForm hook, and it would have become optional. React would complain, and everything might break. That's why we put it in a separate component. And here again, all these hooks are not optional. The component itself is optional, but the hooks in it are not. Okay, I talked a little about hooks. So, we used useMe here, and we also have me here. Let's use our context here too. useMe. We don't need this anymore. This, we don't need anymore. This, we already have. Okay, and here everything is reduced too. Let's check if we have any getMe calls left anywhere. It remains, but only in the app context. Great, we applied the app context. In general, I don't recommend overusing this app context, except for real app context creation scenarios, because if you consistently apply this technology, not only for app context, but for other purposes, your code will become unclear. When you call useMe like this, it's unclear how it happened. You'll have to look into how it's formed, where it's passed, and what it's wrapped in, and it will be hard to maintain the code. So here's the app context. Use it very sparingly. I recommend using it only in this file, exclusively for creating your application's real context to be used everywhere. Okay, we've reduced the amount of code again, and we can move forward. Thank you all. See you soon.